our origins. It has always been a matter of concern to man. Since time immemorial, we have tried to understand who we are, where we come from. Some people have believed in a creator, in purpose. Others in nature, in chance. Today, the latter one has been widely accepted, yet it remains the least understood. But is this creation the result of mere chance, the product of so many a coincidence? Or is it rather the fruit of a deliberate design? To answer this question, we must travel to the very beginning, to the origins of the theory of evolution.
People think that Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. Most of them think that there was no evolution before Darwin, only the teachings of the church, and that he was the one that brought a radical change to modern thought. It is not true.
The concept of evolution is as old as the earliest known written history. Wherever we look, we find this idea. For example, in Europe, we see it in ancient Greece. And one of the first advocates for transformism is Anaximander.
Anaximander had already postulated that human beings must have arisen from a species similar to fish, and that matter was organized by itself by the influx of the energy given by the sun. Which is quite shocking because even today we are being taught similar things. In fact, in a documentary, one evolutionist, P.Z. Myers, flatly stated that human beings were nothing more than fish.
Anaximander, however, took these ideas from his fellow citizen and teacher, Thales of Miletus, whom, being influenced by Egyptian cosmology, named water the arche, the principle or beginning of all things.
This has given rise to a myth. The myth that if there is water, life can appear spontaneously. And someone told my kids in school, no, water has already been found on Mars and also vestiges of life. It's false, completely false. Water is a sine qua non, but life is overwhelmingly complex. And there is this very misleading idea in the textbooks, in students, and people in general. It's a completely wrong idea.
Another philosopher with similar ideas was Empedocles, a vegetarian who claimed to have been reincarnated a myriad of times, but that he would become an immortal god after he died.
He argued that the most complex forms of life come from the simplest ones.
He is the one that introduces the concept of the four elements,
which are air, water, earth, and fire. Besides these two forces, love and hate. So then, based on random combinations, these elements get mixed together and eventually give rise to all living beings.
These four elements would spontaneously produce organs and body parts that would randomly combine, creating all kinds of bizarre creatures. However, the most grotesque and useless beings would eventually disappear. Meanwhile, the better adapted would survive.
Empedocles also believed that this process, a constant complexification of each cycle, returned to a dissolution and a new beginning. That is, an eternal cycle. All of these ideas were from a materialist perspective.
Materialism received its maximum expression with Democritus, a philosopher who traveled to Persia and India in search of wisdom, and who, along with Leucippus, is considered the father of atomism. Democritus theorized about the origins of the universe. Since no one could ever know the outcome of the movement of the atoms, he believed that truth could never be known and that the world was without purpose. Democritus, very likely, was influenced by the atomist and materialist schools of India. On the other hand, Empedocles, like the Hindus, affirmed that the universe was cyclical and made up of 4 or 5 elements. This cosmos, created by the god Brahma, was millions and millions of years old. But even if the Greeks came up with these ideas by themselves, a question arises. On what did they base their ideas?
Their thinking was that man was the measure of all things, and they believed that the gods had no direct revelation with men. So humans had to examine the world, observe it, and speculate. So speculation forms the basis of Greek thought.
What we need to keep in mind is that science in ancient Greece was not like we see it now. Back then, knowledge was not based so much on experiments and empiricism. So, in reality, all of their discussions proceeded just from the field of ideas.
Yet, not all Greek philosophers embraced the concept of transformism. Both Plato and Aristotle seem to have rejected the idea. On the other hand, the spread of Christianity caused some of the Greco-Roman ideas to fall out of favor. However, the arrival of the Renaissance in the 15th century would turn things around.
The beginning of the Renaissance could be seen as the return of the medieval man, who, in one way or another, had a conception of the world as a revelation given by God, a return to his Greco-Roman past, in which man was the measure of all things. Everything had to be examined from a critique of reason itself, which we call humanism.
These humanistic ideals, almost exclusively centered in the artistic arena, would eventually give rise to the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that, unlike the Renaissance, encompassed all fields of knowledge and was responsible for separating faith from reason. One of the first and greatest exponents of this concept was undoubtedly the Frenchman René Descartes, known as the father of modern philosophy.
Descartes was one of the pioneers in regards to the Enlightenment, in the sense that he focused everything on man, and he believed that man should not accept anything, no revelation from outside, without applying a methodical doubt, and that everything should be examined from the very beginning.
A lesser-known contribution of Descartes was in the field of cosmology. Strongly influenced by Democritus, Descartes postulated that the universe was created from a soup of moving particles that eventually formed the stars. In turn, one of these stars would have cooled and solidified, gradually forming the oceans and continents that would make up the Earth.
Of course, Descartes' idea was a breeding ground for other theories about our origins, which started to appear soon after.
However, even the most recent cosmogonies appear to be almost exact copies of the hypotheses postulated by Descartes and Democritus.
The young Earth was still a glowing ball of fire. No sign yet of our blue planet. Little by little, the red-hot Earth cooled down. Rivers, lakes, and oceans appeared.
We must keep in mind that there are two kinds of science. Observational science or experimental science is solely based on observation and experimentation. But there is another kind of science, which is historical science. It is an attempt to know, through the interpretation of our observations, what happened in the past. We cannot experimentally repeat events that happened in the past. We cannot witness the creation of the universe or the formation of the earth. And even if we could observe them, we could not be sure that the universe and our earth were created that way.
The fact is that no one had ever witnessed a chaotic collision of particles forming a complex system such as a dead planet. Let alone the emergence of life itself. Nevertheless, these cosmogonies continued to advance in an enlightened Europe. Some French, German, and English philosophers and naturalists revived and developed ancient Greek transformist ideas. One of the first Enlightenment philosophers to propose the theory of evolution was Benoit de Maillet. Although he did not believe in the flood, this French naturalist postulated that the Earth had been covered with water in the distant past. Based on the supposed slow and progressive withdrawal of water, he estimated that the Earth is about 2,400 million years old. He concluded that the first living things originated in water. Once exposed to air, they underwent a process of evolution and diversification that gave rise to all the animal species we have today. It is still unclear how these primitive creatures adapted to living on solid ground. But he believed that mythological creatures such as mermaids or mermen were evidence that fish were indeed the ancestors of man. Another philosopher who speculated about the origin of the Earth was Georges-Louis Leclerc, Count of Buffon. This French naturalist suggested that the first life forms emerged naturally from organic molecules. But despite these materialist notions, Buffon ultimately ruled out evolution.
Buffon noticed that there were changes in different places of the same kind of animals, which changed when they were in one place or another. Perhaps from two pairs of cats, a big pair and a small pair, came all the big cats, lions, tigers, panthers, and all the small cats, from wild cats to domestic cats and so on. So for him, there was a flow, but it remained within the original nature of each type of being.
Efectivamente, Buffon tenía razón.
Indeed, Buffon was right. Living organisms change, but such changes always occur within a kind. There are many types of cats, but they are all cats. There are many kinds of dogs, but they are all dogs. And this pattern is repeated throughout nature. Living beings change, yes, but within limits. the limits defined by their class.
Ironically, Buffon, a defender of the status quo of species, came to be one of the most influential people in the formulation of the theory of evolution.
Ernst Mayr, for example, he was one of the greatest defenders of Neo-darwinism. Let's say that he was a key player in the modern synthesis. He claims that Buffon was not an evolutionist at all, although he believed that Buffon was the father of evolutionism. And this is due to Buffon's influence and his acceptance of change, which Darwin extrapolated indefinitely. But Buffon did not do that.
Another scientist who pushed Buffon's ideas to the limit was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The French naturalist who had studied under Buffon went on to become one of the greatest evolutionists of the time.
Lamarck tenía un afán.
Lamarck was eager to make evolution an integral process, and he was not the first one, of course.
The basic idea of Lamarckism is that an organism has some characteristics that are inherited by its offspring. So the neck of the giraffe comes from a kind of animal that's similar to a zebra, that struggles to reach the highest branches of the trees and stretches its neck out, making it longer every time. And this characteristic was inherited by its descendants.
Lamarck therefore believed that the animal's effort would cause an internal change that would be inherited by its offspring. As a result, each giraffe would gradually have a longer neck than the one before it. However, Lamarckism, which is still defended by some evolutionists, raises another interesting question: why aren't the offspring of the Padang women, also known as giraffe women, born with long necks?
A blacksmith, for example, could have a powerful arm with which he struck the anvil, but his son was not born with a strong arm. His son was born with the arm of a normal baby, right? In other words, he did not acquire the characteristics. So, they discarded this theory.
Another important thinker under Buffon's influence was Georges Cuvier, who, ironically, was to be Lamarck's greatest critic.
At the time, Lamarck's ideas did not hold water, whereas Cuvier's arguments were well articulated because he was an expert anatomist. If someone gave him a bone from an animal, he would usually reconstruct the animal from the shape of the bone and get it right.
Cuvier understood very well that an organism is an integral system, which means that it is not possible to change one of its parts to an unlimited extent.
So the modification of an animal's bone would require a complete revolution of the animal at once.
He understood very well that the whole organism had to be transformed gradually. This means that it requires hundreds of simultaneous changes in all the organs of an animal. This fact is not taken into account today.
On the other hand, Cuvier became one of the main proponents of catastrophism. According to this idea, the world had undergone many revolutions, or catastrophes, which had devastated the Earth and led to the extinction of many species. The last catastrophe would have occurred 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. However, Cuvier would avoid linking this last event with the biblical flood. In line with the enlightened thinking of the time, the French naturalist hypothesized that the Earth was several million years old, contrary to the biblical account. Despite his rejection of the theory of evolution, Cuvier would have a major impact on it, especially with a new concept he developed: the geological column.
What happens is that when we study the geology of the Earth, we find that most of the land surface is made up of sedimentary rock. Scientists call this phenomenon sedimentation because each layer is the result of deposition. That is, particles, dust, or grains produced by natural phenomena such as wind, ice, and water that are deposited in layers.
The geological column is the belief that these layers of sediment, formed over long periods of time, are somehow a temporary record of the Earth's history. Each layer would be deposited at a particular time and would contain information about the fauna and flora of that time. According to stratigraphic theory, the deepest layers of sediment would be older than those closer to the surface.
Present your evidence, Cornelius.
It was at this level that I discovered traces of an early ape creature, a stage of primitive barbarism, really, dating back some 1,300 years, roughly. It was at this level I discovered cutting tools and arrowheads of quartz and the fossilized bones of carnivorous gorillas. But the artifacts lying here were found at this level.
This allows us to reconstruct something like the geological history of the Earth. In some places, index fossils will appear, then they will vanish, and in other places, other index fossils will appear.
Cuvier's geological column was soon reinterpreted by Charles Lyell, the lawyer-turned-geologist who was open to the concept of evolution, would provide his own interpretation using James Hutton's uniformitarianism.
The concept of uniformitarianism is an assumption that there are some natural processes that we can see in action at the present time. These processes have always been at work, at the same rate that we see today.
Sir Lyell wanted to reinterpret all the strata of the Earth on the basis of very slow phenomena, on a tiny scale, over long periods of time, so that a layer of a certain thickness would take a long time to be deposited by very slow currents of water carrying the sediments, instead of being the result of large flows of water carrying large amounts of sediment, depositing it in a short time, as had been thought, including by Cuvier.
Uniformitarianism is opposed to catastrophism, which explains many natural phenomena on the basis of catastrophes or sudden events, such as the eruption of a volcano or rapid sedimentation.
Lyell would create his own geological column, estimating some strata at 240 million years old. However, given that there was no such thing as an absolute dating method, one can only ask, how could Lyell and his colleagues have calculated such ages?
Since they had never witnessed evolution, the development of a species, they calculated that the time required for a species to change was 1 million years. Of course, this is a completely arbitrary figure, so what we get is circular reasoning. They see a rock with a fossil in it, and it has been given a certain age. So they say, well, this fossil has so many years, 20 million years, so this rock is also 20 million years old. So how old is this fossil? 20 million years. Why? Because it's on this rock. But how do you know that? Because the index fossil is on it. So it's circular reasoning.
The geologic column would also have another serious and inexplicable problem. Fossils would not always appear in the strata to which they belonged.
We cannot say, well, I found this animal in the Eocene layer because the Eocene is on top. Well, what happens if the fossil is underneath everything? What happens? Oh, well, there's been a geological phenomenon of a lateral thrust that has moved this layer over the other, because there's also been a vertical movement. Well, how do we know? Because they are out of order. Oh, but there is no physical evidence that this movement took place. There must have been somehow. So they start making ad hoc hypotheses to try to explain the lack of evidence for these movements.
The fact is that we do not have a consistent geological record. These fossils, they do not appear all the time where they should. So for evolutionists, only if they appear in the right place. They accept it, but if they come out upside down, they look for an explanation that tries to explain why they appeared that way. Some of the clearest evidence against evolutionary interpretations of strata are polystratigraphic fossils. This means fossils that appear in different layers at the same time. For example, we can see tree trunks in vertical position, and they pass through several layers. What does this fossil tell us? It tells us about these strata, that the layers did not form over millions of years, because no tree trunk remains upright for millions of years.
All of these facts should lead us to question the geological column, which is nothing more than a mental construction.
The eruption of Mount St. Helens is one of the best examples of the immediate geological effects of our time. It all began in 1980, when this volcano woke from its slumber. The eruption was of such magnitude that it destroyed everything within a radius of 600 square kilometers. As a result, huge amounts of material would be carried downstream with a powerful impetus. Nothing would stop it. The volcano would also deposit ash in up to 11 states. The eruption would kill 57 people. However, this tragedy would prove to be of some use. Shortly afterwards, some scientists carried out observations and experiments that revealed some surprising data.
The eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington in 1980 created a large area of sedimentary rock where we can see the different layers that formed very quickly, in a matter of hours or days. In fact, the lava that came after formed a canyon that went through these strata, creating an opening that is now known as the Little Grand Canyon. This took place in just a few days or weeks, so it happened suddenly.
Moreover, this event would reveal inconsistencies with current radiometric dating methods.
We know exactly how old these rocks are because there were eyewitnesses who took many samples. Depending on the method, the values range considerably, from hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years. So these facts alone clearly speaks against the reliability of these methods. Because if these samples don't give me a known value, how can I rely on samples whose age I don't know?
This problem has also occurred when using the uranium-thorium-lead method, where rocks of known age have been dated to 4 billion years, or 1 billion years. And yet they could not be that old because they were also rocks of known age from known formations. is well documented.
Nevertheless, Lyell's uniformitarianism would eventually prevail over Cuvier's catastrophism, which would gradually be wiped off the map. But not all geologists would surrender to uniformitarianism. Biblical geologists or creationists resisted the prevailing view. Unlike Cuvier, these geologists believed in a young Earth and a single great catastrophe caused by the biblical flood. After all, was it not more reasonable to believe that one great catastrophe would have produced the geological effects we see today? And was it not more probable that the marine fossils found on mountaintops were the product of this great event? However, the arguments against evolution would not only be based on geology, but also on the conclusions of natural theologians such as William Paley, who in his book Natural Theology would present logical arguments against transformism, and who, ironically, would end up being admired by Charles Darwin.
William Paley gives convincing evidence from the complexity of biological systems, and as early as 1802, in his book Natural Theology, he shows the analogy that if I find a watch, it means that there is a watchmaker who has made it with intention and purpose.
Nowadays, Paley's argument has been renewed, thanks to the discovery of protein machines in our bodies. In other words, we have found real machines inside the cells. Therefore, the arguments put forward by Paley could be perfectly applied to the molecular machines that are found inside cells.
Paley would also counter the arguments put forward by Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus's evolutionist ideas would eventually convince the young Darwin to adopt his grandfather's vision.
Also, Darwin had read Lamarck, whose arguments he did not accept, although he believed in the general concept of evolution. So, on the one hand, Lamarck confirms Darwin, and on the other, he frustrates him.
In 1831, Darwin, fascinated by science and a keen collector, was to see his dream come true when he was offered a place on board the Beagle, a ship commissioned to map the coast of South America. Before setting sail, however, Captain FitzRoy received a request from Lyell to collect geological data. The admiral, who had no expert on board, assigned the work to the unqualified Darwin. The captain, still undecided about evolution, gave Darwin Lyell's book Principles of Geology, which he read with great interest on board the Beagle.
It's very likely that Lyell was one of the leading figures who influenced Darwin, especially with his concept of great spans of time. This enabled Darwin to formulate a theory in which a process was not visible in real time, but was possible on a timescale of millions of years.
At that time, Darwin began to make some observations, but without leaving the Buffonian framework of variation within the major types of life. And he began to speculate about observations he made between the South American continent and the Pacific Islands. So he took Lyell's reasoning for geology and applied it to biology. And also, before or during this period, he had read an essay by Malthus.
Thomas Malthus was an English clergyman and scholar who became very influential in the fields of political economy and population science. In his book, An Essay on the Principle of Population, Malthus speculated on the dangers of uncontrolled population growth. According to this scholar, an increase in wealth will always lead to an increase in population. However, food, which will grow at a slower rate, will create an unfavorable situation of famines and wars. Therefore, Malthus believed that only strict birth regulations would be able to stop the coming catastrophe.
So Malthus applies this to the human population and shows that in a short time there will be a massive food crisis in the world, which didn't happen because Malthus was wrong in a lot of his assumptions. But this idea also caught Darwin's imagination. He said, okay, who will survive? The best, the strongest. If we repeat this in a few generations, small changes will accumulate little by little, just as geological changes accumulate little by little.
While Darwin returned to his home in Britain virtually convinced of evolution, FitzRoy returned convinced of the opposite. The captain was now sure it was a fallacy. FitzRoy, who had presented his observations to the Royal Geographical Society, was to become a great critic of Darwin.
Contrary to the image that is being promoted, Darwin is a child of its time.
Darwin's great role was to put on the philosophical pig the lipstick of science. And there was many people who had scientific objections. But through Darwin's seductive writing, many of them surrendered to the evolutionist philosophy.
Much of Darwin's success, however, rested on the concept of natural selection, an idea that had already been postulated, but without attributing it to evolution. The evidence for this was that artificial selection on domestic animals had never produced new species. Darwin would admit that this puzzled him, but the English naturalist continued to believe that the solution lay in natural selection.
What natural selection tells us is that an individual that is better adapted to its environment will have a longer life expectancy, will be more likely to reproduce and therefore have more offspring, and its traits will become dominant in a population.
Only those adapted to the environment are the strongest and leave offspring. If this process goes on for generations, in the end, according to Darwin, we will end up with a new species of animal that is different from the original one.
In theory, natural selection is a process by which the fittest animals survive and produce offspring, creating new species through an infinite number of changes. However, there are several problems with this idea. Firstly, Darwin never came to define what makes one species better adapted than another. His only explanation was that, well, one survives and the other doesn't. Secondly, how does a blind process like natural selection create new species?
What Darwin's theory doesn't tell us is from where all this diversity comes from. What is the engine? How is the appearance of these new features explained?
It is paradoxical that Darwin's book is called The Origin of Species, when in fact it doesn't tell us the origin of a single species. The only thing Darwin reveals is a real mechanism producing a hypothetical result. Nowhere was the creation of new organs by natural selection observed. And yet he speculated that new organs would appear on the basis of natural selection. Darwin had already discarded the Lamarckian mechanism in his first editions of the book about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Actually, he accepted it again in its 6th edition. He returned to the Lamarckian fold because he confessed that natural selection as such did not have sufficient capacity to generate new traits. And neither did chance.
Nevertheless, 70 years later, the British biologist Ronald Fisher claimed to have discovered the solution. The mechanism of evolution would be found in mutations.
Darwin thought of mutations as something that was ugly, repulsive, deformed, and in no way were they capable of producing new traits in the process of evolution. And this was precisely what Darwin rejected out of hand, but those that accepted the Neo-Darwinian synthesis came to see it as the source of variation. They still had natural selection, but the source of change was mutations.
Consequently, Darwin's finches, given as evidence for evolution, would end up being the result of mutations. But can the modern synthesis, or Neo-Darwinism, explain evolution by mutations?
A mutation is essentially a copying error. Therefore, a mutation can never produce new genetic information. On the contrary, it destroys it.
The claim that changes between species are the result of random mutations, not directed mutations, and natural selection is something that not only hasn't been proven, but also all the evidence speaks against it.
This mutation somehow causes an increasing need for blood. I can only assume that it has something to do with the openings in the hands. They resemble the orifices used by leeches in sucking blood from their host's body. There's no telling how far this has spread. God help us if there are any more of these creatures.
In other words, we are giving the creative power of information to a mechanism that we know is destructive to the cell.
What we are talking about is that mutations, which are changes in the genetic material, either do nothing or cause disease or death. There are no positive mutations, they are a fantasy.
In some cases, one organism can acquire genetic information from another. In bacteria in particular, we can see a process that we call lateral gene transfer. In other words, bacteria can transfer one or more genes to another bacteria. But this process is just genetic recombination. Within the same species, we do not see an increase in genetic information at any given time. There is no new information that was not already present in the species genome.
While some mutations may provide certain advantages for the survival of a bacterium or animal, such mutations will never increase information and complexity. This problem is further exacerbated when we consider epigenetics, a new field of study that challenges the assumption of mutations as the mechanism of evolution.
We have been able to verify that in epigenetics, in a way similar to the DNA code, we can see an inheritance that, well, is basically immutable, and that this genetic inheritance can be activated or deactivated. The keys can be switched on or they can be turned off by a code that is on top, a chemical type of code to which they are exposed to be expressed or not expressed.
When these chemicals, or buttons, are activated, the DNA is unwound. This allows specific protein machines to read the information. As a result, the animal's body will express the information that was previously inactive. While not always noticeable, in some cases this information will manifest itself in phenotypic changes. In other words, changes that are visible to the naked eye. However, these changes will be the result of the expression of pre-existing information in the DNA, not of new information.
In other words, there is a pre-programmed plasticity. Transmutation is a problem. It's transmutation where biology presents a barrier. But also in biology, we see that many organisms have a great deal of plasticity to adapt to different environments and needs.
Despite having no mechanism for evolution, Darwin's theory would gradually become more popular, gaining ground and followers. However, Darwin's popularity would not have been possible without Thomas Huxley, who not only vigorously defended the theory of evolution, but also made Darwin a celebrity. On the other hand, the German Ernst Haeckel, who would go down in history for his many scientific controversies, would be another of his great defenders.
Well, we can see that there was an unstoppable drive in Haeckel. He became Darwin's bulldog in Germany, the same way that Thomas Huxley was in England. And he spread the evolutionist thesis through every possible medium.
In order to prove the theory of evolution, he drew embryos of different species, that he showed their similarities and postulated that the embryos went through different stages and that in some way they represented the evolutionary history of that species. For example, in the case of human beings, he explained that they had gone through an amphibious or fish stage and said that they had a cavity in the lower part of the head which represented the gills. This has been shown to be false, as it has nothing to do with the breathing organism. However, the drawings made by Haeckel still appear in some textbooks.
I heard this thesis many years ago, even 20 or 30 years ago. It was taught with absolute certainty by biology professors, although I never really understood it, even as a young man. But when we objectively compare real embryos with the drawings made by Haeckel, we can see that he completely retouched them, even to the point of falsification.
Furthermore, Haeckel's evolutionist ideology would lead him to conclude that the destruction of babies and the physically and mentally handicapped was a justified duty. Haeckel would say the following:
"What a vast amount of trouble and sorrow for their families, and what a huge private and public expenditure. How much of this pain and expense could be spared if people could make up their minds to free the incurable from their indescribable torments by a dose of morphia?"
As if that weren't enough, Haeckel was one of the many educated people who believed in polygenism. In other words, that the white man was of a different race from the blacks, which was more primitive and closer to the apes. It is not surprising, therefore, that Haeckel was one of the first to speak openly about the Jewish question. This German naturalist was thus fully involved in politics and had a great influence on the Nazi ideology that was soon to emerge. Another of Haeckel's great achievements would be the missing link, which he believed would be found not in Africa, as Darwin believed, but in Asia. Convinced of his hypothesis, Haeckel commissioned a drawing of the long-sought missing link between apes and humans, Pithecanthropus alalis,
which means the voiceless apeman. Haeckel was ridiculed by many colleagues for this picture because, of course, he was using his imagination instead of explaining the existing evidence. He made up data that did not exist in the hope that it would be found, because evolution was true, and he had to find the bridge between ape and man. It had to exist.
Haeckel was never to find the missing link, but someone else claimed to have found it. His devoted follower, Eugene Dubois.
So then Eugene Dubois decided that he was going to be the one to find it. The missing link, the Pithecanthropus, which already existed as a drawing, but it did not yet exist with physical data.
On the island of Java, which is now Indonesia, he found some remains, a few bones. Precisely, he found a skull, 3 teeth, and a femur.
When he found the human femur, there were also some human teeth there. He telegraphed Haeckel, seeking his opinion, just consulting him, and Haeckel answered back saying, "From the inventor of Pithecanthropus to its happy discoverer."
The remains did not appear in the same place. They were 15 meters apart, so we cannot be certain that they belong to the same individual. Nevertheless, further analysis confirmed that 2 of these teeth belonged to an orangutan, and the third was human.
Incidentally, just before he died, before Dubois died, he revealed that he had found 2 human skulls in an area that geologically matched that of Solo, the Solo River, where he had found Java Man. How could he find a man together with his predecessor? So this, based on the evolutionary thesis, does not fit.
Nevertheless, Dubois clung to the idea that his discovery was undoubtedly the remains of an advanced ape. In other words, a missing link.
Paleontologists, in their zeal to find evidence to support the theory of evolution, have made several mistakes in interpreting the data they found. One of the best examples is Piltdown Man, found in southern England.
News of the skull remains found by Charles Dawson in 1912 were quickly picked up by the international press, while many scientists fully endorsed Dawson's discovery.
"40 years later, when these bones were exposed to the scientific community and studied in detail, it was discovered that some of these bones came from an ape and some from a man. The bones had been altered and made to look older, artificially, to make it look like they were really from an ape man. It is now widely recognized that the Piltdown Man is one of the most famous frauds by evolutionists in the history of science."
However, before the truth about Piltdown Man was known, another great discovery was announced in the United States. The Nebraska Man.
What stands out about this discovery is the way the press published the finding in those days. There was even the drawing of a man walking in an ape-like fashion. You could see the fauna in the background, his wife in a river doing her chores. And all these gorgeous details that illustrated this discovery came just from a single tooth that they found.
And the finding was endorsed by Professor Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was at the time the director of the Field Museum of Natural History.
Osborne would also be one of the many scholars to endorse the discovery of Piltdown, as well as postulating his own particular theory.
The discovery of the Nebraska Man had its historical significance because at that time, in the 1920s, it was when the famous Scopes trial took place.
The Scopes trial, one of the most famous court cases on evolution, was a legal case in which John Scopes was accused of teaching human evolution in the state of Tennessee, an action prohibited by the Butler Act.
Public schools were not allowed to teach that man came from apes. Firstly, because it had not been proven, and secondly, because the people of the state of Tennessee had their say. It was a law that had been passed on behalf of its citizens. So the American Civil Liberties Association made up a test case in which they persuaded a coach and substitute teacher to incriminate himself for teaching evolution in order to test the Butler Act and see if they could defeat this law at a higher judicial level. They already knew that the professor would be found guilty and fined $100. Nothing else. There was no jail time. There was none of the false parody that they showed in films like Inherit the Wind.
It is interesting because one of the parties, the one that took the evolutionist position, mocked the other part, which was a man from Nebraska, and made a whole series of jokes because they had found the tooth that belonged to a man from Nebraska, just like him.
Of course, in that trial, the professor was found guilty. But in the end, there was a technicality, and the thing did not go ahead, and everything ended as if nothing had happened. Except for one factor. They made a campaign that was seen throughout the United States press, making fun of Christianity, laughing at the biblical account of origins, and making the evolutionist professor the great hero of the day. And it was all false.
So false that Scopes, at that moment, did not even have a girlfriend.
Tell them you're sorry. Tell them it was all a mistake. Please,
Tell them if they let my body out of jail, I'd lock up my mind. Could you stand that, Rachel?
Afterwards, Scopes said that he did not even remember that he had taught evolution, that he certainly did not remember teaching such a thing. But these statements were made later, when it was all finished, when all the propaganda and harm had been done.
Scopes also stated privately that his students had been instructed by his lawyers to lie on the stand. The teacher never revealed the truth in public for fear of his lawyers.
So it was a great propaganda victory, in which, incidentally, Nebraska Man played an important part.
And it was this same tooth, 2 years later, that the Science magazine announced that it was no longer a human tooth, but rather the tooth of a pig.
Despite the failure of Java and Nebraska Man, paleontologists have not lost heart. Since then, other alleged missing links have been found, but none has been as convincing as the one Donald Johanson unearthed in Ethiopia in 1974. A fossil called Lucy.
You know what? The other day I was in this museum, and you know what I found out?
What?
The first ever woman was named Lucy.
Is that supposed to make me feel better?
Yeah. No.
Well, Lucy is another proposal for a missing link, which actually has a lot of similarities with the Nebraska Man phenomenon. In other words, the fossil that they found didn't have any feet, but the models on display in the museums appear with well-defined human feet. She also didn't have hands, and yet the hands are shown as entirely human. And these are all characteristics that make it look human. There's even a photo where they present Lucy as if thinking. Lucy is also displayed with the white part of the eyes, which is a characteristic only found in humans. This is done in order to give it more authenticity, but there is no basis, no real scientific basis.
Johansen would admit that Lucy's skull, as small as a chimpanzee's, did not provide clear evidence of evolution, so he concluded that the proof was in her bipedalism. In other words, Lucy started walking upright before her brain developed. So Johansen affirmed that the evidence was in her hip bone.
A story that I find quite illustrative and peculiar is the one about Lucy's hip bone. Her hip bone doesn't have the shape that can allow this species to walk upright. So, what Johansen imagined, what he postulated, was the possibility that during the process of fossilization the bone would have flattened or deformed.
According to anatomist Owen Lovejoy, these pieces of hip bone, which had been fossilized for millions of years, made the pelvis look very different from the original one, which was supposedly well adapted for bipedalism. Despite the lack of evidence, Lovejoy was determined to find a solution.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
So let's say that shouldn't let experimental data destroy a theory that you like.
Despite Lovejoy's ingenious plan, the anthropologists Hausler and Schmid would conclude that a reliable result was not possible due to the state of the hip bone. Furthermore, the anthropologists would even question her femininity. Lucy had just become a man, and his name was Lucifer. Studies made by other anthropologists on related fossils would conclude that Lucy's anatomy was well adapted to live on trees.
It's an unknown type of anthropoid creature that we didn't know before. And that's all there is to it. There's nothing much to say.
When these errors are discovered, or when the theory changes, the public usually doesn't know about it. It doesn't make the front page. And even one of these scandals, one of these frauds, is always accompanied by another discovery, another theory that says, "Now we have found it." They don't think about what happened with the previous one. We believed a lie for 30 years.
Books aimed at the average reader usually say that the fossil record proves evolution. But paleontological experts know this is not true, and some of them are honest enough to say so, such as the late Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University, who says that the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record remains the trade secret of paleontology. Even paleontologists from Harvard, the British Museum, the American Museum, the Chicago Field Museum, distinguished people, true experts in the subject, they say, no.
In reality, none of these transitional fossils exist. There is no fossil in which we see that it is being transformed from one type of animal to another type. We don't see a gradual appearance of new organs that did not exist in the original genre. In short, we do not have any transitional fossils.
Since time immemorial, materialistic philosophy has been trying to explain the origin of life, yet the horizon of this great paradigm somehow seems to vanish in the distance. And sometimes, like a mirage, it emerges summoning those who wish to drink from the ancient pool of water. This illusion, so distant and difficult to imagine, is now known as abiogenesis.
Abiogenesis is the claim, or the attempt, to understand how life could have arisen by itself. That is, how life, starting from simple compounds, atoms, or simple molecules, in its diverse manifestations, could have arisen all by itself, without the intervention of any external intelligent force.
To understand where this idea comes from, we need to go back in history to Aristotle, who, among many other things, popularized the hypothesis of spontaneous generation.
People like Plato or Aristotle, and the ancient peoples as well, believed in spontaneous generation. For example, if there were dirty rugs and seeds rotting away, mice would appear. And if there was spoiled meat, flies would arise.
So, according to Aristotle, some animals were either created spontaneously from organic compounds or were created naturally inside the animals themselves. This idea, which gained widespread acceptance, lasted well into the 20th century.
It was a widespread belief. There were some people that didn't believe in it, but the first ones to test this idea were Redi and Spallanzani, and finally Pasteur, who made it possible to eat canned sardines, among other things.
Pasteur was finally able to prove that microorganisms did not arise spontaneously from organic substances, but that they were carried into the organism through the air. However, both Haeckel and Darwin were reluctant to give up on spontaneous generation. Darwin believed that spontaneous generation might have been possible in the distant past under very different conditions. In the early 20th century, the Russian Alexander Oparin adopted this idea, speculating that a primitive Earth with very little oxygen could have facilitated the spontaneous generation of elementary particles for life. Oparin was never able to verify his idea with a single experiment, but throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, numerous experiments have attempted to prove it. One of these was the Miller-Urey experiment, carried out in 1952 by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, which attempted to produce spontaneously the first molecules essential to life. The aminoacids. There are currently more than 500 known amino acids, but only 20 are encoded in DNA and are therefore essential for life. Each amino acid, which has a unique structure and design, is made up of molecules of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Thanks to the instructions given to them by the DNA, the amino acids join their molecules together to form a long chain. This sequence, which varies according to its function, can have more than 33,000 amino acids. Furthermore, it has to be folded and adapted to give it a three-dimensional look, specifically designed for the function to be performed. This complex process results in the formation of the protein.
There are many functions carried out by the proteins, but essentially everything that goes on inside the cell is carried out by them.
They're like the machines that make the cell do what it's supposed to do. A visual cell, a digestive cell, a muscle cell. Each has its own unique proteins to carry out the function for which it was designed. This complex process results in the formation of the protein.
Miller therefore believed that the mystery of life would be solved by the spontaneous production of amino acids. Or so he thought.
What he did was to imagine a primitive atmosphere in which he mixed gases such as ammonia, hydrogen, methane, and water, passed them through an electric current for several days, and then found a layer of a black substance, a kind of pitch, in which he was able to identify some amino acids.
There are several important things to note here. First of all, Miller is an intelligent man. I mean that he planned the whole experiment. Beginning with the fact that he already knew the chemical composition of the amino acids, so he added these. Those compounds, which were formed from nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and so on.
In other words, the experiment was perfectly designed to produce the expected results. However, the amino acids would not be so easy to obtain.
While they were being formed, he had to isolate them immediately because the same watery element quickly decomposed the amino acids.
These synthesized organic compounds were not stable in the same reactions and had to be removed from this state to stabilize them for later analysis.
And then there is another fundamental problem. Miller's experiment requires something, which is the absence of oxygen, what is called a reducing atmosphere, an atmosphere without oxygen. If there had been oxygen in this supposed primitive soup, it would have decomposed immediately. The amino acids would have been denaturalized, because oxygen is destructive to these primary molecules. There's no evidence that there ever was an atmosphere without oxygen. The atmosphere we have today is 21% oxygen, even more. We can also find evidence in Precambrian rocks. That means rocks that are older than those layers with living organisms. These rocks have oxidized iron in them. What does that mean? Well, it means that there was oxygen on Earth before the spontaneous origin of life.
On the other hand, Miller's experiment never demonstrated how a long sequence of amino acids could be assembled in the precise order needed to form a protein.
Just one amino acid out of place, just one amino acid in a sequence of hundreds or thousands of them, can make the protein useless and even cause the person or animal to die.
In other words, what Miller and Urey really proved with this experiment is that there were random reactions, and that they produce a variety of random compounds, in which these amino acids were found.
So proportionally, there is a huge inconsistency. It's like saying, look, we found a brick, so we already know that the Empire State Building could have formed spontaneously. Or we've got a piece of iron, so we know that an Airbus A380 with thousands of cables, software, and so on, could have formed spontaneously. That's the proportion. To pretend that from the formation of a single amino acid we can infer that life formed by itself is a fantasy.
In spite of everything, Miller's experiment still features in many textbooks as one of the great scientific milestones of evolution. Moreover, it would give rise to various hypotheses about the origin of life.
Some people talk about microclimates and say that life could have originated in them. Others talk about extremophiles, that is, microscopic beings that live in extreme environments, such as next to a volcano. But there is no real explanation that allows us to say, this is what evolutionists believe. They are all just partial attempts, and when this guy says one thing, the other guy says the opposite. So there's no real explanation of how life came about. There's just none. There's nothing.
So what we have here is a bunch of speculative theories about how the first elements came into being, the first organic molecules that could be precursors to life. In other words, how the first biological building blocks were formed.
While some evolutionists have speculated that proteins may have been the precursors of life, others have postulated that the answer lies in DNA, which would have evolved from RNA. But what is DNA?
All of us have, in the nucleus of each of our cells, an instruction manual, which is DNA. That's DNA, and it carries encoded information. It is a code. People talk about the genetic code, but there are other codes. The computer binary code of zeros and ones, where each letter, each number, is represented by a combination of zeros and ones. Or the code for the blind people, the Braille code, or the Morse code. Well then, DNA is a code.
Indeed, DNA is a highly sophisticated chemical code made up of a long chain of nucleotides. Each nucleotide is made up of a nitrogenous base, a phosphate group, and deoxyribose. The nitrogenous bases, or nucleobases, are adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, or A, C, T, G. These four letters are the cornerstones of DNA and determine much of the information in the genetic code.
However, the information in the cell is not in the chemical elements of DNA. It's rather in the order in which these chemical elements occur. In much the same way as in a modern language, the order of the letters determines the meaning of a word. But if we change the order, or sequence, in which the letters appear, we get a word with a different meaning. So then, information is in the sequence and not in the letters themselves. What we learn from this is that genetic information comes from an intelligent agent, and this is because only an intelligent mind can express the information and codify it in a sequence of letters.
This compound, each of the letters, does not form spontaneously in nature, and even less does it arrange itself. So even if someone were to put all the nucleotides together, they would not be created spontaneously. They would not form sentences that could be read in order to produce the right proteins. This is like someone going to the beach one day, and he sees the low tide and finds something written, "Manolito loves Juanita." Well, first of all, he is not going to think that the sequence of letters was created by the tide going up and down or by the wind, but someone wrote it because it is intelligible. You can understand what it says. How could anyone think that 3 billion letters with perfectly structured sentences can appear by chance? Even less so when you know that from a physical chemical point of view, they can't form spontaneously.
The difficult or fascinating thing to explain is the concept of information inside the DNA. Because information requires a code, a language, and communication. And these are characteristics that always involve some intelligence. So the difficult thing is to explain how a chaotic natural process is able to create information with meaning and purpose.
This information found in each of the myriads of cells that make up our bodies is stored in a structure called the nucleus, the cell's vault. Inside this box, the DNA is stored and rolled up into individual packages called chromosomes. Each cell contains an exact copy of the 23 pairs of chromosomes that make up the human genome. In other words, each cell contains all the information our body needs to function properly.
For example, human beings have about 3 billion letters. 3 billion letters. So in perspective, it is like all the information found in a library, containing 1,200 books like Don Quixote, more or less. So it's a crazy amount of information.
In order to help minimize space, this large amount of information wraps around proteins called histones. In turn, each histone is made up of 8 proteins. But how are these proteins and all the proteins necessary for our body formed? It all starts in the genes or sections of DNA that contain the necessary information for creating each type of protein. During the transcription process, the enzyme or protein machine called RNA polymerase is attached to the beginning of the gene. The enzyme divides the DNA and begins the process in which the nucleic bases that are in the cell's nucleus attach to the corresponding letters of the DNA, thus creating a long chain of RNA, called messenger RNA. However, before it's used as a template for protein production, it must undergo a process where some sections of RNA are either removed or added. Once finished, the RNA will carry the information out of the nucleus, while the original DNA will remain safe inside the cell's vault. Once in the cytoplasm, the ribosome, a machine made up of about 80 proteins, is attached to the messenger RNA. The ribosome will read the information expressed in the RNA to create a chain of amino acids. This process will require the help of molecules called transfer RNAs, which will carry the corresponding amino acids to the ribosome. In this manner, the components are added one by one, forming a long sequence that in some cases can contain up to 33,000 amino acids. Finally, this chain will be folded in a determinate shape to form the protein for its proper function.
In order to reproduce, a living being needs genetic information and proteins. So there is a problem in trying to explain the origin of life because we need genetic information and proteins, which manipulate genetic information to create the new being. It's a difficult problem because in order to have proteins, we have to have DNA. And in order to have DNA, we have to have proteins. So what we have here is a dog biting its own tail.
So which appeared first, RNA or protein? But the protein has to be in a perfect sequence for it to work. And that exact sequence is only given by the coding in the gene part of the RNA. And even worse, there would have to be a protection, a wall for this nucleus, because otherwise they would decompose in an aqueous medium or exposed to light. So they would immediately decompose this whole functioning structure. It's really an unsolved problem.
In terms of the origins of life, we would have the chicken and the egg problem, and some other element in which neither could exist without the presence of the other.
It's not by chance, and its origin cannot be the result of chance. Because of its extraordinary complexity and interconnectedness. So you need all of them for the system to work. You can't leave any out.
The more and more we learn about cellular metabolism, the cell, far from being a simple entity, it's actually a very complex factory.
What was once thought to be something very simple has now, with advances in biology and biochemistry, become a galaxy of complex systems.